May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. Amen. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab. He, his wife, and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. The names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Araphats from Bethlehem in Judah. When they went to the country of Moab and remained there, but Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These 2 took Moabites as wives. The name of one was Oprah, and the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard that in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, and she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you had dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was some hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Oprah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. When you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, even if death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said nothing more to her. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
I decided to preach from here rather than behind there, otherwise it would be a floating head. The Book of Ruth, a story we are familiar with. In this short 4-chapter book, we are ushered into the lives of one particular Hebrew woman and her 2 Moabite daughters-in-law. all become widows. And then in quick succession, we read they are childless. In the space of 5 verses, this tragedy unfolds. Yet in the spaces between these 5 verses, much has been left unsaid. Why did Elimelech and his family venture on their own in search of food? And why Moab? Were there no other family members, their clan members, who would travel with them? And where is that extended family that would have hunkered down together in Bethlehem during that famine? Was this survival at all costs? What was Elimelech's motivation for taking his family away from the clan during a most desperate time? These questions arise for me in force. As an Asian American woman of 1.5 generation, these questions are not idle ones. Not idle ones born out of just intellectual curiosity. They signal the internal struggle and the wrestling of what it means to belong both to a collectivistic community and an individualistic one as an Asian American. For over 2 decades, both as a pastor and now at the seminary, I have met with many Asian Americans, and especially women, who come to me to talk about their internal struggle to individuate while remaining faithful and loyal to their parents and their families. For Western ears, it's hard to fully comprehend the internal conflict, and the response can often be a simple and quick answer: do what is best for your growth and well-being. The reality is, doing what is best for me in light of a collectivistic system is very tricky. It may be best to listen to one's inner longings and hopes, but to do so can come at a very, very steep price. Isolation, rejection, abandonment, which can be experienced for a short period of time or even for a lifetime. Collectivistic societies function wholly different from individualistic ones. Both have strengths and weaknesses. So these questions that arise regarding Elimelech's decision to move away from his extended clan betray for me something far deeper. And in my research, it appears that I am not alone in my unresolved questions. The Midrashic writers also wondered the very same thing. And according to Caspi and Haverock, Midrashic writing took 4 forms: the aesthetic, the interpretive, the moral, and the contemporary. In the interpretive, the Midrashic writers try to explain the ambiguous language of the Bible by presenting a story by a particular rabbi that reimagines the narrative by crafting another narrative alongside it. Midrash Ruth Rabbah is one of the oldest midrashim, written more or less during the time of Song of Songs. They understood the circumstances and the context of that time. Moab was in enemy territory. Why would they leave and go to, of all places, an area that was despised? The Jews at that time considered all Gentiles to be dogs, yet one commentary says that Moabites occupied an even lower position in Jewish thinking. And why? It went all the way back to the way that Moab treated Israel on their way to the Promised Land. In Deuteronomy 23, the verse says, "No Ammonite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the way when they came out of Egypt." Thus Moabites, along with Ammonites, were relegated to an ongoing religious outcast system. Additionally, Moab was known as a group of pagan worshippers of Chemosh, a god that demanded child sacrifice. And the Moab nation descended from an incestuous encounter from Lot and his oldest daughter. So Moab was no neutral place to settle. It came with tremendous history, and yet it is to this place that Elimelech takes his family. So one might reason that the famine was so bad that it didn't matter where they were to go. It was about 70 miles, shorter than perhaps going all the way to Egypt. So was it out of desperation to feed his family that he made this decision? But what about those who are left in Bethlehem? The Middle Easterners I know today talk about the strong bonds of commitment to one's immediate family, as well as to their extended relatives. When someone from your extended family moves to the area or immigrates to the United States, it's expected that your family will be there to provide for you until you've acclimated. In a collectivistic society, it would be unheard of to just decide to go it alone, unless you were going to send back money or resources to your family. Remember the story of Jacob and his sons in Genesis 42? There was a famine during that time too, and when Jacob heard that there was grain in Egypt, he sent all 10 of his sons, minus one, to go down and purchase grain and return with the grain to the whole clan so that they would be sustained. In this story, the 4 of them leave, but they do not return to take food purchased in Moab back to their clan. They stay in enemy territory for over a decade. Then to imagine their lives in Moab. Elimelech and Naomi were aliens, and they lived in a land that viewed them as hostile and perverse. They would have lived as the other in Moab, living as strangers. Ask any immigrant who lives in a land that is not their country of origin, their country of birth, what it feels like to live in a land that is not their own. It is a harsh reality filled with difficulties and anxieties, especially until you retain that language. But even after attaining the language, there's difficulties of adjustment, and daily, on a regular basis, different customs and values are different in this new land. And often, no matter how much you try to meld into your new place, your status in the land can be provisional, as we've seen in our own setting, where hostilities and prejudices prevail. So on the one hand, there can be the appearance of comfort and relief. But on the other side, there's another story. Naomi decides to return back to Bethlehem upon hearing that the famine had ended after over a decade in Moab. She decides to return without a husband, without her sons, and unable to convince both her daughters-in-laws to return to their mother's house. One returns. Ruth decides to go with her mother-in-law to a land that sees her as an enemy. And as they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the townswomen said, "Is this Naomi?" She was remembered, but barely. Listen to an oral reflection on the text by Aviva Zorberg. When they came to Bethlehem, all the city was in a turmoil. In a frizzen, va-tehom in Hebrew is a very strong word. It's a word for panic. It means to be stunned. It means not being able to understand the beginning, the middle, or the end of what's going on. Everyone is in a panic when they see Naomi walking along the road. They don't give any physical description of what Naomi looks like, but one can imagine. When they see Naomi walking along the road, they ask, "Is this Naomi?" And that speaks worlds, its existential wonder. How could this happen to the woman we knew? She looks like the husk that has been left over after the core of life has been removed. It's not just that she doesn't have her husband with her, she doesn't have her children, she doesn't have her property, and that seems to have affected her very selfhood. It's not that she comes back alone in her full selfhood. Her selfhood has ended. End of quote. If indeed she is but a husk of a person and her selfhood has ended, why didn't the village care for her upon her return? Instead, her daughter-in-law Ruth was forced to find food by gleaning after the workers and picking up the scraps that they left behind. Commentators and midrashic writers of Ruth Rabbah offer this explanation for Naomi's suffering. Elimelech's name means God is king. The Jewish interpret this to mean that he was most likely from a wealthy family. Another interpretation contends that his name was interpreted as meaning one eager for royalty. Another commentator talks about the term Ephrat as an early name of Bethlehem that could connote a higher socioeconomic status or reputation in Bethlehem. And so the Midrash describes the motivations that were behind Elimelech's decision to move to Mount Moab. They say he left the land of Canaan not because he himself would suffer from the famine, but because he was afraid that people might apply to him for help. Their interpretation for the suffering inflicted upon this family was that it wasn't merely a matter of moving to enemy land to protect themselves from the famine, but that instead, Elimelech did not want the responsibility of caring for the extended family. The move was a move of irresponsibility. Memories and grudges long held, those who were slighted and offended by this past transgression will not respond. Even though they could see that Naomi's selfhood has ended, they are not moved. So Ruth takes it upon herself to do what is necessary to find food. She seeks out a means of survival designated to her by the Israelite law. Deuteronomy 24 says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the alien. I am the Lord your God." Gleaning is only a short-term solution and only available during the harvest season of 7 weeks. It's not a solution that would lead to economic self-sufficiency. Poverty is not ended by gleaning. This is the life of Ruth and Naomi, hand to mouth, no family.
Our reading is in Spanish. La lectura de hoy es Hebreos capítulo 12, versículos 12 al 15. Escuchen la palabra de Dios. Por lo tanto, renueven las fuerzas de sus manos cansadas y fortalezcan sus rodillas debilitadas. Tracen un camino recto para sus pies, a fin de que los débiles y los cojos no caigan, sino que se fortalezcan. Esfuércense para vivir en paz con todos y procuren llevar una vida santa, porque los que no son santos no verán al Señor. Cuídense unos a otros para que ninguno de ustedes deje de recibir la gracia de Dios. Tengan cuidado de que no brote ninguna raíz venenosa de amargura, la cual los trastorne a ustedes y envenene a muchos. Our New Testament reading is Hebrews chapter 12, verses 12 through 15. Listen to the word of God. Therefore lift up your drooping hands and strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. Strive for peace with everyone, and for the holiness without which no one will see the Lord. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many become defiled. This is the word of the Lord.
So whether we attribute the villagers' lack of compassion towards Naomi and Ruth because of Elimelech's desire to flee the responsibility to his village or not, we know that the realities of community life are always tenuous. What may begin with warmth and kindness can easily disintegrate, and misunderstandings and divisions and leavings happen. And though we strive to become that community that exhibits love, forgiveness, forbearance, and kindness, the all too human ways we seek to understand one another can get in the way. Attribution theory is concerned with how people interpret particular events and how this impacts their thinking and behavior. We've been doing a study on this in implicit bias at the seminary. There are two particular ways we do this: dispositional attribution or situation attribution. Dispositional attribution assigns the cause of behavior to some internal characteristic of a person rather than to outside forces. Situation attribution is when we assign the cause of behavior to some situation or event outside a person's control rather than for internal characteristics. So whether we attribute Naomi's family leaving Bethlehem for external reasons like the famine, or because of internal personality predispositions, memories are long held, and they become barriers for kindness and compassion in the present. And though Naomi's appearance caused a panic in the town, and though they could see that she was a husk of a person, yet even that was not enough to elicit compassion. The village gossip having gone out to the community, even the unnamed kinsmen, and later we learn of Boaz, do not elicit the sense of obligatory family response upon their return. In a patriarchal culture, without the support of a husband or son was death. So by the community's inaction, what awaited them both was death, sure death. And Ruth knew all too well that her choice to attach herself to Naomi was a decision of death. Returning to her mother's house, like Orpah did, was the wise and the sane decision. To attach herself to Naomi and to move to a foreign land that despised her was sure death, and Ruth's choice of survival would have been better within her own community. But instead, she decides to step into the gap and becomes the only source of solace for Naomi. The building of community is a volitional choice. It's chosen daily. It's a decision that suspends judgment and blame. The reality is that our vision is always partial. How many times has my own sense of understanding of things been wholly, completely off. I interpret things based on my own lens, my own sense of life circumstances, my viewpoint. Attribution theory states that when it comes to our own personal circumstances, we are much more apt to assign it as situational. This means we're more likely to explain the reasons for the decisions that we make to our context, to our environment, and to issues that remain completely outside of our control. Yet, when it comes to understanding others, we are much more likely to explain another's behavior having to do with personal, internal characteristics that they possess. And perhaps this is the problem we are facing in community. We explain our shortcomings as out of our control, but for others, we attribute an internal personality defect. Consider all the times that you may be prone to attribute to a stranger or an enemy or a foreigner's behavior as a result of flawed personality. But when we explain our behavior, we ascribe it to something completely out of our control. Ruth and Naomi experienced what it meant to be on the margins of society. They understood all too well what it meant to be vulnerable. We live in interesting times where there is an ever-deepening wall of hostility, which is palpable, visceral, and deep. The interior venom is no longer hidden or restrained, but now posted casually on social media. So how do we become that beloved community of God for the world? I recently saw a documentary about a blues musician. It's called Accidental Courtesy. Daryl Davis, Race in America. He's known for his boogie-woogie piano playing, and he's played with the likes of Chuck Berry and Jerry Lee Lewis. Aside from his love of music, he is especially passionate about improving race relations. And in the documentary, you learn very, very quickly that his focus on race relations is primarily to members of the Klan. The entire time I watched this, I kept thinking, how can this African-American man find the courage and the compassion to become friends with the Klan? How is this possible? The question he asked members of the Klan is this, to every single one he meets: why do you hate me when you know nothing about me? In establishing relationships with Klan members, he has collected the robes of 40 to 60 Klansmen who have left the Klan as a direct or indirect response of their friendship. It's mind-boggling. It takes such courage and love. It's uncomfortable watching. I am uncertain if I would have that kind of love for my enemy. But I'm reminded that there are stories of people who stand in the gap and who decide, rather than to ask, who is my neighbor, choose to live into the more important question, to whom will I be a neighbor?